Is it time for Labor to endorse the government's policy, including turning back boats and offshore processing?
Well, I think it's a bit soon to say that any policies have worked, given that there's certainly been reports this year of boats still setting out from Indonesia. It's not really a question of whether the policies have worked when you still have people desperately trying to get on those dangerous vessels and travel to Australia through that very difficult patch of water. I think it's pretty clear from our platform that we support offshore processing. It's also pretty clear from the things that we did in government. My predecessor as the member for Griffith, you recall, Kevin Rudd, brought in some changes that, for example, made it more difficult for Iranians to get visas through Indonesia, and of course firmly restated our position on offshore processing, including saying that people who came to Australia by boat, though we would respect their rights and our obligations as a refugee convention country, would not ultimately be settled in Australia.
What's the difference then between the government's policy and Labor's policy? Is there any?
I think we're very different. We're very different, Chris. For example, we certainly don't demonise refugees. We've openly said we will not use the phrase illegal when it comes to people coming to our country and asking for asylum.
Okay, apart from semantic differences, what are the differences in policy?
I think that dismissing things as being semantic differences completely misunderstands the point of what we're talking about here, which is what sort of attitude do we as a nation have to people who are fleeing persecution? And Labor's attitude is that we want to help people who are fleeing persecution. We want to increase the humanitarian intake. We want to work with the UNHCR to help people find settlement. At the same time, we are a pragmatic and realistic party that understands that these are very complicated issues. If you are getting to Indonesia from Iran and then being faced with the choice of waiting for UNHCR processing or getting on a dangerous boat, not knowing how dangerous that boat actually is, and there's a whole range of complications in that that are evident just from that brief description. And so the question for Labor and for any party of government is how do you provide as much assistance as we possibly can, because there's 10 million refugees in the world and we're a small country of limited resources. How do you provide as much assistance as you possibly can while avoiding policy settings that actually contribute to harm?
I think the government, though, will be tempted to boil it down to one or two issues. They see this as a potential election victory. If they can boil it down to one specific issue, such as boat turnbacks, it will be in their political interest to do so. Let me quote what your leader, Bill Shorten, said yesterday, which has excited some of this debate. Here's the quote: "If we have policies which drag people here to hop on unsafe boats and drown at sea, well, I'm not going to be party to that." And that has raised the possibility of Labor endorsing boats turned back. Do you endorse his statement?
Well, how could anyone disagree with what Bill Shorten said? Nobody wants to have policy settings that drag people here on unsafe boats. I mean, if people think that people who are in Indonesia making a decision about whether to get on a boat have some sort of informed choice, if they think that people who are fleeing persecution are in some way fully armed with all the facts that they need to decide whether to get on that boat, I think that that misunderstands the vulnerability of the people who are seeking our assistance. So the question for us is, do we want to be responsible or not? And to me, I think that the real issue here is, you said just before that it seems likely that the coalition will try to oversimplify and boil this issue down. That's the real problem. It is so irresponsible and reckless for the coalition to take the approach they have taken in respect of this issue by turning it into a partisan vote winner instead of finding a bipartisan consensus so that Australia can actually help the people who are in need of help. And there's a lot that Australia can be proud of in our humanitarian work. We do take a large number of refugees. We do help settle people in our community. I've got a lot of African refugees, for example, in my local area that Australia has assisted. I've got Iraqi refugees. People do want to help. To turn this issue into a divisive issue instead of an issue that unites Australians in generosity and assistance, I think is reckless and I think it's wrong. So I would like to see a coalition actually talking to the opposition and talking about what bipartisanship can be found on this issue. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that they are too reckless, too weak, and that they will continue to act in the way that they previously have because it's worked for them. But to me, that would be the ideal.
The Labor Party refuses to acknowledge the importance of turnbacks where safe to do so. It refuses to support temporary protection visas. And just as was the case under the Howard regime, before an election, in the middle of a parliamentary term, they'll try and sound like they believe in our policies, but as soon as they get into government, they unwind them. We saw the disaster of that under the Rudd and Gillard governments. Despite all the rhetoric, it took this government to solve the problem. And critical to that were turnbacks, where it was safe to do so, and temporary protection visas. And Labor will not sign up to that. And if they ever get back in control of this policy area, they will unwind the successful policies for the second time and recreate the problems we had over the last few years.